Welcome, everybody, to the F4 Hunger Awareness Show.
It's my goal to feed 1 billion people before I die.
We want to bring awareness around the issue of hunger and food insecurity.
7 to 8 million people served so far. With the sole goal of eradicating world hunger by connecting sources of food to recipients in need. Fiorenza's Food for Friends.
Hey everyone, I'm Derek Fiorenza with the F4 Hunger Awareness Show, and I'm joined by our familiar guest, Joseph Giandonato, PhD candidate, MBA, MS, CS, health, wellness, and fitness researcher, and educator, and all-around great guy, one of the smartest people I've ever met. He knows something about everything, and today we're going to be covering a really cool topic. It's going to apply to everybody, all of us. So, Joe, what are we going to be talking about today?
Thank you for the introduction, Derek. I'm honored and humbled to be on today's, podcast as usual. So thank you for giving me the platform to, educate and empower and inspire others. Today we're going to be discussing vitamin D. We're looking at, what it's constituted of, as well as its sources, and also how vitamin D is metabolized in the body. So you could also reference the article that I've authored, which appears in the F4 blog, from boosting brain power to protecting heart health, nature's superhero, vitamin D. So today's itinerary, we will deconstruct D. So again, talking about, its structure and also comparing its structure to other constituents, specifically hormones that are found in the body, because vitamin D, spoiler alert, is more closely aligned with those hormones because it is a hormone. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. Also, how it's metabolized, its versatility, also diving into the research just a bit. So we'll be examining how vitamin D can improve multiple facets of one's health. Also, how to build your defense and, looking at sources, looking at dosing. But, first of all, looking at getting, your vitamin D levels tested and how to accomplish that prior to a conclusion. And then, taking a few questions, from you, Derek, and, some of the podcast viewers. So, vitamin D is not a vitamin at all. In fact, it is a steroid. So steroids are one of three biohormones, biomolecules that are found within the body. Okay, so first, we have peptides and proteins, and then we also have amino acid derived, constituents. Are looking at something like melatonin, and then we have steroid hormones, which include testosterone and estrogen, which are sex hormones, and then also vitamin D. So we'll learn why vitamin D is a steroid. It's specifically a secosteroid. Now, it shares more in common with testosterone and estrogen than over-the-counter fat-soluble vitamins. It's prominently involved in calcium homeostasis, phosphorus absorption, as well as bone mineralization. So we think of vitamin D, we think in terms of, bone health, and that's precisely why dairy products, as well as cereals, are fortified with vitamin D. Now, the reference range is around, 20 nanograms, per milliliter. And this is something that can be ascertained through a blood test. If we're a little below, then that may warrant vitamin D supplementation, possibly some sun exposure. If it's a little higher, we may need to evaluate the diet, which may, contain a lot of food or excessive amounts of food that contain a lot of vitamin D. Vitamin D, at very high doses can be hepatotoxic or liver toxic. So we're going to make sure that we're, mindful of that. Now, deficiencies may result in weak bones, joint pain, as well as rickets. Globally, nearly 1 billion people are vitamin D deficient, and approximately 35% of American adults are vitamin D deficient. Excessive vitamin D levels can cause vomiting, calcinosis, or having different calcium deposits throughout the body, and also fatigue. So structural similarities. So we have here, these tetracyclic rings, and also having this backbone, so to speak, that you see right here, which is shared among testosterone, estrogen, and vitamin D, which structurally makes it a hormone. In addition to that, too, how vitamin D interacts with various cells within the body makes it a hormone too, because it has some hormonal properties. It promotes growth and repair, anabolism, as do testosterone and estrogen. So vitamin D is produced endogenously. It, along with other biomolecules, are naturally occurring. They can be consumed exogenously through diet and also supplementation. So we can, we'll look at some of the sources of vitamin D shortly, and then also discussing, some supplementation options. Now, ultraviolet rays, will be absorbed by the skin, particularly, the epidermis, in which it'll be, converted to 7-dehydrocholesterol, and then it will be transported to the liver, where it is then going to be converted to 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, at which point it will be shuttled to the kidneys, and then it is finally converted to its fully active form, 125-dehydroxy vitamin D3, or calcitriol. Now, when we consume vitamin D, whether it's going to be from a vitamin D supplement, or it's going to be consumed, from, a beverage, or perhaps we have here, some cereal that contains, 6% of your vitamin D daily value, it's going to be emulsified by lipoprotein particles. Or if we look at, components, or, constituents rather, of fat, or they eventually are the building blocks of, cell walls and also cell membranes. Now, at which point these lipoprotein particles, which have emulsified the vitamin D, are going to be absorbed by the lymphatic system. So this is why vitamin D is considered a fat-soluble vitamin, because fat is involved in its metabolism when consumed exogenously. Okay, so if I was to pop this open and take a capsule of vitamin D, which is the recommended dose on this bottle, it's going to be metabolized through fat. Now, it's going to be transported to the liver from the lymphatic system, and then that conversion will ensue, where it's going to be converting from 25-hydroxy vitamin D3, then shuttled to the kidneys, and resulting in the end product of 125-dehydroxy vitamin D3. So definitely some tongue twisters right here. It's reminiscent of the time, Charles Barkley was trying to pronounce Jonas, Valanciunas on NBA on TNT a few years ago, and they trolled him hard. So here we have a fun little chart where, we have the sun's ultraviolet rays, which are now, being absorbed by the skin, and that process, continues. We also look at, dietary intake, so exogenous consumption of nutrients containing D3, or looking at supplementation, but the end result is 125-dehydroxy vitamin D3. And as it alludes to right here, it's going to help establish, calcium homeostasis. And we'll learn a little bit more about that and how it's going to benefit not just bone health, but also globally, in particular, brain and also cardiovascular health. Vitamin D is very versatile. It interacts with target cells through a number of body systems, which include parathyroid glands, dendritic cells, T cells, keratinocytes, as well as osteoblasts, thus mediating the function of thyroid, nervous system, immune system, skin, and also bone metabolism. So it's going to support synaptic activity, because it's going to, improve neurotransmission. A lot of benefits are associated with vitamin D, which extend beyond boosting or bolstering bone health. So a research review, and again, I compiled a number of, articles within that blog, Vitamin D levels are linked to a risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So if we are not consuming a sufficient amount of vitamin D through the diet, not getting a sufficient amount of sunlight, that could potentially result in insulin resistance, which in turn can perpetuate type 2 diabetes. Also, preventing and treating viral infections. So they have been shown to, proffer improvements in immune system functioning. Also, vitamin D levels have been associated with, managing endometriosis. And endometriosis, is a rather complex condition, but it results in the overgrowth, of tissue outside of the uterus, which can induce a lot of pain, and it could also, impede fertility, which is very critical, among females, particularly of childbearing age, and a lot of females are, going to be looking at different, fertility treatment options. But why don't we just start maybe, at square one when we look at, our lifestyle? So we're looking at physical activity and more germane to today's, podcast, nutrition, and, looking at our vitamin D levels. We'll talk about that shortly. In addition to that, too, vitamin D levels are linked to total LDL cholesterol as well as serum triglyceride levels. So vitamin D has been shown to modulate oxidative stress. So we look at oxidative stress, which is emanating from pollutants, in the air that are found in particulate matter from exhaust, whether we're looking at vehicle emissions or we're looking at, energy production emissions. Also, oxidative stress that is associated with, you know, smoke or, inflammatory, substances such as, maybe a diet that's going to be rich in, processed foods. Also, intense exercise, can elicit increase in oxidative stress. So typically, you're going to have, different, um, you know, oxidative, stressors. So we're looking at, C-reactive protein being one, superoxide, which again, in, large amounts, is definitely going to be detrimental to, our cardiovascular health. So that's one thing that we need to, take into account, reducing inflammation. So we've seen how vitamin D can reduce, inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. It could also reduce inflammation, of the arterial system. And vitamin D, through its role in, calcium homeostasis, can influence calcium signaling and also staving off vascular calcifications, which initiate atherosclerosis or some of those changes, those degradative changes, which involve, plaquing of the arteries, which can, elevate, stroke and also heart attack risk. And then also vitamin D has been shown to regulate endothelial and also vascular smooth cell function. So that can reduce blood pressure, thereby reducing the risk of a stroke. So how do we build our defense? And we don't necessarily need an elite perimeter defender, a Gary Payton, or, an elite wing such as, a Scottie Pippen. We do, however, need vitamin D. Now, how do we get vitamin D? We'll talk about that shortly. We first need to understand what are some of the symptoms that are associated with deficiency. So we're not just going to go ahead and say, you know what, hey, I need vitamin D because it's recommended. Well, your vitamin D levels may be sufficient. We'll learn a little bit more about that. But you could be dealing with muscle weakness. You could be susceptible to colds and illnesses, experiencing fatigue, depression, as well as impaired wound recovery. So you're looking at, could be a laceration, could be, an abrasion or a contusion. And if that's slow to dissipate or slow to heal, and you have all of these symptoms in concert with one another, it could possibly be, vitamin D deficiency that it is attributable to. But since a lot of these symptoms overlap with other conditions, potentially more nefarious ones, we want to make sure that we rule some of those out. And we could also look at getting a routine blood test to measure those calcitriol levels or the 125 dehydroxy vitamin D3 levels. Um, and again, if we're below 20 nanograms per milliliter, then it may warrant vitamin D supplementation, but we want to make sure that we consult our physician. We also want to consider the time of the year. So historically, vitamin D levels are going to be lowest for individuals that reside above the 30-degree latitude parallel. So typically, people that are going to be maybe in the Carolinas, Tennessee, around like Atlanta, Birmingham area, if you're north of that, um, north of maybe like the fall line in Georgia or South Carolina, because you're going to have a winter that may be a little bit more harsh. That's precisely why you don't have alligators that live in those areas. Then you're going to be susceptible to vitamin D levels that are going to be a little bit lower because you're not getting as much sunlight, and sunlight is the superior source of vitamin D. Those ultraviolet rays, which are metabolized by the body through that aforementioned process, that results in that active form of vitamin D3. So again, getting regular sun exposure is beneficial. However, we have to consider, if we have a fair complexion, and we have maybe dermatological issues, or a history of maybe cancer, specifically skin cancer, within our family, then we limit our sun exposure and we get more vitamin D through our dietary pattern. And that will comprise of, meat, poultry, beans, fish, specifically salmon, tuna, and mackerel, egg yolks. Although if you have higher cholesterol, you know, maybe not opt for the yolks, but we could look at, mushrooms perhaps. And there's a wide range of mushrooms that contain, significant amounts of, vitamin D that are sufficient. Organ meats, such as liver, and of course, fortified dairy products, as well as cereals. So we will see that vitamin D has been infused in here. So one cup of cereal served dry will get 6% of your daily value. And then if we're consuming some milk, assuming that we are consuming, I believe, skim milk based off of this, um, then we're going to be increasing more than doubling our vitamin D consumption. So for adults aged 18 to 70, we want to aim for 600 international units, which is the recommended daily allowance. And then the tolerable upper limit is 4,000 international units. If we, exceed that significantly, then you run the risk of hepatotoxicity of the liver because again, the liver needs to metabolize, the exogenous, vitamin D. And here we have a list which shows, different food sources as well as their associated vitamin D content in international units. And if we recall, the aim is, 600 international units with a tolerable upper limit of 4,000 international units. So this provides, some examples here. To conclude, vitamin D is much more than a vitamin. It is a steroid hormone with immense health fortifying capacity, sans the negative connotation of its sex hormone siblings and the derivatives. Further research, both extant and emerging, vitamin D lives up to its reputation of being a superhero of sorts as it repels disease and reduces inflammation, enabling us to stay healthy and perform better. Before one revamps their diet or clears bottles of vitamin D from the shelves of their local pharmacy, getting a blood test to ascertain 125 dehydroxy vitamin D3 levels and consulting their physician is highly recommended. One thing that I want to point out is, we have, two forms of vitamin D. So we have vitamin D2, or ergocalciferol, which is derived from plant sources. And then we also have vitamin D3, which is cholecalciferol, which is derived from animal sources. Vitamin D3 has been shown to elevate serum vitamin D levels more quickly because it's faster acting. In addition to that, too, vitamin D2, is also, has a shorter half-life. So, it's not fast acting or as fast acting as D3, but it clears the system more quickly, than D3 too. So that's one of the things that we need to consider. The optimal source of vitamin D, particularly vitamin D3, is from sunlight. A suboptimal source of vitamin D would be, vitamin D2. And a lot of individuals who ascribe to, a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle where they're limiting their consumption of animal products and animal protein specifically, are going to be at risk of having lower vitamin D levels. And, you want to make sure that you are supplementing with vitamin D3 at that point and also getting a sufficient amount of sunlight, if you're able to do so.
That's amazing. I have a ton of questions, Joe.
Thank you, Derek. Fire away.
Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Are you sure you're ready? Because I've got
I'm
a
ready. Are they multiple choice, open-ended, essay?
lot. My first question is, what is the name of this blood test that we should be getting?
You could get a standard blood test. You could, recommend, that your physician, include that in the panel. I
You
don't
say
want to,
include a
take it.
D3 test. That's it. Include a D3
Yeah.
test.
So really what you're looking for is, 125, hydroxyvitamin D3, and that's what it's going to appear, on your lab. You could request that from your physician. I don't know if that's going to be covered, by, your insurance. I don't know.
What's the level, the range that you should be at?
Well, it should be close, to, 20, milligrams, or nanograms rather per milliliter, as referenced here. It should be, around that. If it's significantly less, that will be indicative of your vitamin D3 levels being too low. And if it's above that, we really need to consider, examining the dietary pattern, because if those levels are very high, your liver could potentially be, stressed.
Dude, wow, that's unbelievable. All right. And then a couple other questions I have for you. So, um, going outside, you said that sunlight is the absolute preferred and best way to get vitamin D3. How long do you have to stay in the sun in order to maximize that benefit? Is it all day? Is it 15 minutes?
That's largely be subjective because, the absorption of those ultraviolet rays is going to be determined, by the body, surface area, which is going to be clothed or, covered with, sunscreen or lotion or, moisturizers. In addition to that, too, the melanin content, within your skin. So individuals that, have darker complexions are typically going to require, more protracted periods of, sun exposure, to elicit, increases in, vitamin D3 levels. So it's something that's very, subjective and also individualized. So, my recommendation would be to, consult your physician, consult specifically a dermatologist, um, because again, you need to make sure that you are moderating your sun exposure. Now, if you're getting any sun exposure, my recommendation, and again, this is based off of the literature and also anecdotally, is try to get some morning sunlight or even some evening sunlight because it's not going to be, as intense as midday sunlight. Um, so, probably you don't want to get it like, around, dusk where, you're seeing, some of those, ultraviolet rays being, distorted and they become these crepuscular rays, if you will, and they become more red and dark shades of amber and orange, because that's not going to emit a sufficient amount of, ultraviolet rays. But ideally, maybe an hour or an hour and a half within sunset, or maybe, an hour to an hour and a half following sunrise will be sufficient, and we can incrementalize that. But my recommendation before consider that is to, consult your physician or ideally, a dermatologist before you proceed.
I heard recently somewhere that you shouldn't wear sunglasses because it's good for your eyes. But then I've heard other people say that you should wear sunglasses because it's bad for your eyes. Is any thoughts on that?
Don't look at a solar eclipse.
There you go.
um, kidding aside, I would definitely, consult, an ophthalmologist, but I would not, obviously look directly in the sun. And again, eye protection is so critical, especially if you are outside, for long periods of time.
Yeah. Sunscreen you mentioned. So is sunscreen a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I know it's designed to prevent skin cancer, but there's a lot of chemicals in it. And also, if you're wearing sunscreen, are you getting the same benefit of the D3 from the rays?
As I mentioned before, that is going to affect the absorption of those ultraviolet rays, which in turn is going to affect, the D3 level, or vitamin D levels, within your body. As it relates to, sunscreens, we want to look at, sunscreens that are, non-comedogenic, so they're not going to, clog pores. There should be a moisturizing component to that also. And again, it's probably best that you consult, your physician or specifically a dermatologist, before consider, sunscreens. But there are benefits to it because, again, you have to weigh it where it's like, okay, is skin cancer, worth it? And, based off what I've read and what I've learned is that, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if there's any discoloration of your skin where it's become red or inflamed following sun exposure, that increases your, risk of developing skin cancer because there's been, damage, of the epidermis. There's been damage of that matrix, and that damage could potentiate, cancer development.
Okay. Do you know if fasting has any benefit for vitamin D3 levels?
Not that I've seen, in the literature. It's something that is definitely, worth exploring. Um, but again, whether you are, fasting or whether you're ascribing to any sort of, dietary pattern that is aimed at improving a facet of health or suffice to say, body composition, you still need to make sure that you're getting a sufficient amount of micronutrients.
Yeah.
Vitamin D is still considered or classified as a vitamin, which in turn is a micronutrient. Um, and we want to make sure that we are, consuming a sufficient amount of that, whether it's through sunlight or through the dietary pattern.
Okay, cod liver oil. Why is that so good for you?
I haven't done much, research on cod liver oil specifically, but cod is very high, in vitamin D. You know, content right here. So if you check this out, scrolling back over
Yep.
here,
Mhm.
one tablespoon of cod liver oil contains a lot, almost a third of your the tolerable upper limit, but beyond containing vitamin D, beyond containing um, you know polyunsaturated fats and a bevy of omega 3 and omega 6 fatty acids.
Mm.
I really don't know much about, cod liver oil, so to speak, but the omega 3 and omega 6 fatty acids that are found in cod liver oil can, reduce, inflammation, and they're also really good in addressing, cardiovascular health due to their cardioprotective effects.
So is I've never had cod liver oil. Is that something that you could put like on a salad, or you just have to like drink it in a tablespoon?
I've never consumed it. I know I kind of seem, sheltered. Probably wouldn't want to, consume that, via tablespoon, unless I had a really good chaser, which would be like a milkshake.
But
And then you kind of negate,
it's
you kind of
almost
negate,
all of your vitamin D3, Joe.
yeah. Yeah, I probably wouldn't season a salad with cod liver oil. I don't want to try it either. Maybe it's a
Yeah,
challenge we could do. I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely contains a lot of vitamin D, and then also comprises some of those fatty acids that are cardioprotective.
I love that. You mentioned on one of the slides a link to LDL cholesterol. What was the link? That low levels increase it or high levels increase it?
So low vitamin D levels have been shown to increase
Ah,
your LDL cholesterol. So
really?
it has an inverse relationship. Yes.
Oh my gosh. So say that again.
So if you have low vitamin D3 levels,
Yep.
that will lead to, or has been shown to be linked to, high LDL cholesterol.
Unbelievable. And
As
that's
an
the
inverse
bad
relation.
cholesterol, right?
Yes, that's the bad cholesterol. Well, not the worst. You have very low density lipoprotein or VLDL cholesterol, but it's still pretty bad.
That's amazing. There's so much here. So the takeaway, oh, and last question I had was on winter
Sure.
time. So when you're uh, getting sun exposure in the winter, is it not the same potency as the summer?
Well, it really all depends. I mean, if you're living, in this in the southern, hemisphere, during our winter, it's their summer, so you're going to be closest to the sun. If it's winter in the northern hemisphere, obviously, the sun is going to be further away due to the tilt of the Earth's axis.
Right.
So the sun is slightly further away. It's still 93 million miles away. Maybe with the tilt, I haven't done the calculation. Probably have to get Neil deGrasse Tyson on the podcast. But I would imagine that the ultraviolet rays are not as potent, just because you are a little bit further away. But also, too, your sun exposure is limited by virtue of it being colder, and
Yeah.
then also, you're now wearing more clothing, and your body skin surface area is now being covered more. So it's really recommended, especially if you live north of that 30-degree latitude parallel, that you're consuming a dietary pattern that is rich with vitamin D. And again, we'll toggle back, not as awkwardly as we did before, to view some of these sources.
Yep. It's interesting. You mentioned 35% of US adults, and then I forget, did you say a billion people
Yes,
around the world
approximately a billion. Yes,
are vitamin D deficient? And I think
yes.
about the numbers in our country. So we have like around 45 million people that are food insecure. They get some type of food assistance program.
Hmm.
And I wonder if in those demographics, if the vitamin D deficiency is even greater.
There's definitely an overlap, and we have to look at, again, food insecurity, but we can also look at, food deserts, and I and
Yep.
I know that there's an overlap between, food insecurity and also, food desert, because typically, food deserts are going to be nestled in impoverished areas, whether they are rural or urban,
Yep.
which is going to limit accessibility to healthier options. A lot of these individuals are going to be more food insecure because there's going to be less economic opportunities
Yep.
for individuals who may not be able to travel because they can't safely walk or they don't have reliable transportation. Um, but we can assume that there is an overlap of individuals that are food insecure as well as individuals that are vitamin D deficient. And we see in developing parts of the world,
Yeah.
high incidence of rickets, which you'll see bow-leggedness. You'll see
Oh my God.
typically you know weaker bones, so the really the bone matrix is compromised because there isn't as much bone mineralization that is transpiring, because now you do not have the sufficient amount of calcium to, for a lack of a better word, balance the bones, metabolism, and and also you're looking at that impacting, phosphorus absorption. You may not be able to consume that much phosphorus because your nutritional sources are not sufficient, or you may be experiencing famine.
Joe, I grew up thinking that milk had a ton of vitamin D in it. Is this chart, if I'm reading that right, it doesn't look like it has that much in it, unless I'm reading that wrong.
Well, it could really vary. It doesn't specify a serving here. Well, actually, it says 3 to 40 liters, it appears, if I'm reading that correctly.
But that's way less
Um,
than cod liver oil, like for example. So like,
I'll
but I'm
have
just
cod
saying,
liver
like,
oil.
yeah,
Have cod liver oil with your cereal and get
yeah.
back to me. Um,
But I mean,
you know,
like the idea of strong bone, drink your milk, like that was a whole thing growing up.
well, because we're consuming fortified, milk for the most part. So we have
Or to what?
fortified milk and infant formulas, fortified juice.
Okay.
Um, and you'll have a lot of cases where they're going to be fortified with other fat soluble vitamins. They'll be fortified with calcium also, but cow's milk or organic, cow's milk that's not adulterated, is not homogenized, and also not infused with some of those nutrients, or fortified, is going to have less vitamin D content.
Wow. Are you referring to like raw milk that's not
Yes,
pasteurized?
yes.
Got it. And then I didn't see I saw egg yolks, 20 to 25 per egg yolk. So if you have an egg white, you're not getting the benefit of the vitamin D from the eggs.
Yeah, you're roughly going to get a fraction of that. But again, it's
What's
really
the amount we need per day?
it's
What
really
was the amount you
striking a balance. So it's for adults aged 18 to 70, it's going to be 600 international units, with a tolerable upper limit of 4,000 international units.
So 600
So
is a lot. I'd have to eat a lot of eggs to get there.
well, based on the math, and we'll roll it back to 20. You would need 30 egg yolks a day. Then you're done.
So the chances are that most of us are not getting anywhere near enough vitamin D.
But you're also not accounting for
Sunlight.
fortified dairy and cereal products. You're also not accounting for sunlight, as
Yeah.
you mentioned, I believe. Um, but a lot of folks are not getting sufficient amount of vitamin D, as well as other micronutrients, so other vitamins, because vitamin D is classified as a vitamin, even though it's really not. Not getting enough minerals. And again, that's by virtue of, a suboptimal dietary pattern, people eating based upon convenience,
Yeah.
taste, affordability.
It's almost you wish you had like a, battery on you that would show you once you had enough vitamin D sunlight. Like your phone tells you when it's charged. Like, oh, I got
Yeah.
my vitamin D for the day.
Well, hey, let's work on that. Okay. But kidding aside, I mean, this could be ascertained with a blood test, which is ordered by your physician, and also you
Yep.
could even purchase, these blood tests, online, or at a pharmacy too, for $20 or $30.
Yeah.
Um, so I would definitely consider getting this tested on a regular basis, because again, you could potentially rule out the causes of different symptoms.
How often
Um,
would you get a test, Joe?
again, that's really based upon your lifestyle, and certainly your preferences. But getting this done seasonally would be beneficial. Um, so that way you can modify your dietary pattern as needed, or you could modify your outdoor activities as needed to either increase or temper your vitamin D consumption.
I learned so much today. I never thought I'd be this fascinated about vitamin D. And now I'm like super fascinated for myself personally. I want to figure out what I could do more around it. And then I'm also thinking about the population that we serve and support
Mhm.
through our food recovery and food drives. the food we're collecting, the food we're
Yep.
serving, the food we're distributing,
Hmm.
and then the the deficiency in vitamin D. I think you alluded to some of those illnesses or ailments that come from it. It's pretty scary.
For sure, and again, we see a lot of, comorbidities, with rickets and starvation, rickets and other, conditions, and they're more prevalent in developing parts of our, country. I don't have an incidence rate for the U.S., but I imagine that it's infinitesimally small or non-existent, because again, you're going days without food, in those cases.
Hmm.
So I think as it relates to, sourcing foods, from some of your generous donors, considering, the full scope of the micronutrients that are found, within, these foods, and definitely want to, shout out to all the organizations that, support F4 in, your noble efforts to help, feed families, across our area and across the nation. But certainly, cultivating, donated foods that have, more full nutritional profile. They're more nutrient dense, because that's what's going to, benefit those who are in need. And it'll help allay some of those, conditions which we had discussed, which are associated with, low vitamin D levels, or symptoms which are associated with low vitamin D levels that can compromise quality of life.
Does the body pull from like different areas if it's deficient in one vitamin or mineral to make up for it, and then that like kind of like when you have an injury and you
That,
compensate for an injury, does the body do
that's
that?
That's a great question. So individuals that are, malnourished, or not getting a sufficient amount of nutrients, specifically, calcium. Like if we have somebody, maybe that's an alcoholic, or maybe someone that is, using drugs. And again, the focus isn't on, thriving, but more so, surviving at that point. So they're really not planning meals. They may not be eating, regularly or frequently, if at all, for maybe a couple of days. Um, so now what's going to happen is the body's going to leach, some of its, calcium stores, from bone to facilitate, muscular and also cardiac, contractions. Um, so it's very, very, interesting, and that's specifically why, we want to make sure that we are getting a sufficient amount of nutrients. So that way, our body doesn't feed on itself. It's different if we're fasting.
Yeah.
It's different if we're doing maybe some low intensity, steady state cardio, maybe in a quasi fasted state. And then you're going to be a little more reliant on, fat as a fuel, or specifically free fatty acids that have been mobilized. But that's intentional.
Right.
It is largely unintentional, to burn through non-contractile, tissue or lean body mass, specifically bone. And also we have cases where, you know, amino acids, that are found within contractile tissue or muscle, is now, being, leached or being converted into, glucose, as a process known as gluconeogenesis, and you'll have that, transpire among endurance athletes, or individuals that are in a long fasted state, or not consuming a sufficient amount of macronutrients, specifically, carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe endurance athletes, are going to be at greater risk of that too. So that is a great question.
I know, tie it up with this one. Last time we were on the podcast together, we talked about sleep. Does
Mhm.
lack of sleep lead to more vitamin D3 deficiencies? Do you know?
I haven't seen any, correlation in the literature, not to say that it doesn't exist, but,
Yeah.
if we do have, poor sleep quality, or we have poor sleep duration, that could potentially lead to, reliance on, caffeinated beverages. And, caffeine is, an adenosine, antagonist, and, it interacts with Y-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, um, to essentially, block both of those, which can induce, fatigue or, a state of, restfulness. Um, However, if we're a little bit more reliant on caffeine, that could affect, metabolism of other minerals. I've seen in the literature where, calcium metabolism can be affected. So indirectly, sleep may, impart some impact on, vitamin D, consumption as well as metabolism.
Amazing. This has been so informative. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience, Joe, that you think would be important or impactful?
Most certainly, first and foremost, or again, just to reiterate, how grateful I am for this opportunity, to connect with, with readers and also viewers. Um, I fielded some questions. I have my contact information, which is my full name, at gmail.com. Definitely encourage some folks to reach out. Also, if you have the opportunity, when you do, publish this on various social media platforms, share a link to the blog post, from earlier this week. I'd be more than happy to connect with folks that have questions or comments, because it shows that you're number one, you're reading, number two, that you're impassioned about improving your life or the lives of others.
Well, Joe, we appreciate it. And every time I talk to you, I learn something new. You're just a wealth of knowledge and information. So
Hey,
thank
I
you.
try my best. I try my best. I appreciate everything, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you. And this has been a very special presentation today of the F4 Hunger Awareness Show. We had Joseph Giandonato with us talking about vitamin D, and sometimes you're deficient, sometimes you have a surplus. Um, it was very informative. So, Joe, we want to thank you for joining the Hunger Awareness Show. And with that, I'm Derek Fiorenza signing off.